Cold sweat trickled down the politician's forehead, mixing with the cement dust. The air, once heavy with the smell of fresh mortar, was now dense with panic. The K9, an animal trained to detect death, wouldn't stop. Its front paws, once agile in obedience drills, were now relentless hammers against the wall that he, the politician, had just tried to seal. Each scratch, each piece of cement that flew, was a direct blow to the heart of his charade. The politician, whose name was synonymous with order and morality in the public sphere, felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. His heart pounded like a war drum, echoing the frantic rhythm of the dog's paws. He tried to grab the animal's collar, but the K9 snarled, a guttural warning sound that made him instinctively recoil. It wasn't a common aggressive growl, it was a growl of urgency, of an unnegotiable mission. The dog knew. The dog had always known. The layer of fresh cement, still damp and malleable, gave way quickly. What was once a uniform grey surface was now an irregular hole, an open wound in the structure of the country house. The politician watched, paralyzed, as the K9's paw unearthed something darker, denser. It wasn't brick, it wasn't rubble, it was fabric. A piece of silk fabric, in a vibrant shade he recognized with icy terror. It was the scarf she wore around her neck. The scarf he himself had given her. The K9, with one last powerful scratch, removed a larger portion of cement. And there, exposed to the faint light of the work lamp, was the tip of a shoe, a delicate high-heeled shoe made of soft leather that he also knew. The color, a passionate red, screamed in contrast with the dull grey of the cement. The politician stumbled backward, his back hitting the opposite wall. The smell. Now, besides the cement, there was a different smell, a sweet, putrid, unmistakable odor. The smell of death, which the K9 had detected long before he even considered the possibility of failure in his macabre plan. The dog, satisfied with its initial revelation, stopped digging for a moment. It looked at the politician, its dark eyes fixed on him, as if judging him, as if condemning him. Then, with a sharp, urgent bark, the K9 returned to the attack, now with more fury, as if wanting to unearth the whole truth at once. The politician felt bile rise in his throat. He had to stop the dog. He had to cover it up. He had to undo what the animal was revealing. But his feet were nailed to the floor, his mind in a whirlwind of denial and despair. Every movement of the K9 was a blow to his reputation, his life, his freedom. More cement broke away. More of the truth came to light. Now it wasn't just a shoe, it was the hem of a dress, the fabric draped strangely, as if the body was contorted. The K9 snarled, pulled, and with a final tug, an arm emerged from the cement. A pale arm, with cold, inert skin, adorned with a gold bracelet he also recognized. The bracelet he had bought for her on his last trip to Geneva, his mistress. His disappeared mistress. She wasn't on a secret trip, as he had told the press. She hadn't run off with another man, as he had whispered to his advisors. She was there, walled up, in his own country house. And his own dog, the faithful K9, had unearthed his darkest secret. The politician felt a scream trapped in his throat, a scream of horror, of regret, of pure panic. The K9, oblivious to his agony, continued to dig, determined to free what was trapped. The woman's head began to emerge, her dark hair tangled with cement, her face distorted in an expression of frozen terror. Her eyes, once full of life and passion, were now mere empty sockets fixed on a distant point. The politician fell to his knees, his hands trembling, his breath ragged. The smell of death was overwhelming now. The K9 finally stopped digging, sat beside the partially exposed body, and let out a low lament, a sad howl that seemed to echo the tragedy that had just been revealed. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the politician's uneven breathing and the slow drip of fresh cement trickling down the wall like stone tears. The image of the woman, his mistress, walled up, was irrefutable proof. Proof of his crime, proof of his downfall. And the canine, his loyal companion, had been the instrument of his own condemnation. The world, which he had manipulated with such mastery, was about to collapse on him, and it all began with a dog, a wall, and a secret that could not remain buried. The politician, whose name was now a whisper of shame in his own mind, remained on his knees. The slow drip of fresh cement, once an insignificant sound, had transformed into the macabre ticking of his time. Each drop was a second less for his freedom, a hammer knocking on the door of his imminent prison. The canine, his faithful canine, sat beside that horror, head bowed, a silent guardian of the truth. Its eyes, once full of loyalty, now seemed to carry the weight of judgment. The smell. Ah, the smell. It was a dense, sweet veil that enveloped everything, penetrating his nostrils, his throat, his soul. The smell of death, of failure, of the rot of an unearthed secret. He tried to breathe, but the air seemed poisoned. His stomach churned, threatening to expel what little dignity he had left. He looked at the body. Her dark hair, once silky, was now a tangled mass of cement and dust. Her face, distorted by terror and the rigidity of death, was a grotesque caricature of the woman he once loved, or thought he loved. The gold bracelet, a gift of love and guilt, gleamed faintly on her pale, inert skin. It was her, undeniably her. There was no more room for denial, for the self-deception that had kept him sane or insane for weeks. A shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't the cold of the country house, but the cold of condemnation. He had planned everything with meticulous precision. Her unexpected trip, the forged messages, the story of a new love, a sudden elopement. The press had swallowed it. His advisors had spread it. No one would suspect. No one would ever know. Except for the dog. The dog knew. And the dog had spoken. The politician, a man accustomed to commanding, manipulating, controlling narratives, was now at the mercy of an animal. An animal that, with its instinctive and unwavering loyalty to the truth, had undone his entire empire of lies. The irony was cruel, the humiliation unbearable. He tried to stand. His legs, however, refused to obey. His muscles were stiff, paralyzed by shock. The image of his walled-up mistress was a mirror of his own soul, now exposed, naked, and macabre. He extended a trembling hand, not to touch the body, but to cover the hole, to undo what the canine had done. A useless, desperate gesture. The cement was damp, but the damage irreversible. The canine, as if reading his thoughts, let out a low growl, a clear warning. Not to touch, not to hide. The truth, once revealed, could not be reburied. The politician withdrew his hand, feeling overwhelming helplessness. He was trapped between the wall and the truth. His mind, once a labyrinth of political strategies and eloquent speeches, was now a battlefield of panic and regret. The headlines, the news, the downfall, the shame, the prison, the loss of everything, his career, his reputation, his family, everything would crumble, and he would be the architect of his own ruin. He looked at the work lamp, the faint yellow light illuminating the scene. It seemed to mock him, exposing every grotesque detail. The dripping cement, the pale arm, the red shoe, an infernal painting created by his own hands. The canine, with a slow movement, raised its head and looked towards the country house door. A distant sound, a car approaching. The politician's heart leaped, a drum of panic even louder. Who could it be? No one should be there. No one. It was his isolated country house, his secret refuge for his darkest secrets. He tried to stand again, this time with renewed urgency. He needed to think. He needed to act. But his body still wouldn't respond. Panic was a knot in his throat, suffocating any logical thought. The sound of the car grew clearer. Then the crunch of tires on the gravel road. Someone was coming. Someone was about to discover. The living room window, once a portal to the tranquil landscape, was now a threat. The K9 let out a bark, not an alert bark, but a bark of recognition, a bark for someone it knew. The politician felt an even more intense chill. If it was someone known, the situation would be even worse. It wasn't a stranger who could be dismissed. It was someone who would ask questions, someone who would see. He crawled, desperate, towards the body, intending to cover it with anything, any piece of tarp, any cement bag. But the K9, anticipating his movement, positioned itself between him and the body, a wall of unwavering loyalty to its discovery. The dog growled again, a firmer, more threatening growl. It was an insurmountable barrier. The front door of the country house opened. A soft sound, almost inaudible, but one that resonated like thunder in the silence of that personal hell. A voice, a familiar voice. "Darling, are you here? Where have you been? I said I'd come earlier to help with the wall." It was his wife's voice. The politician froze, his eyes wide with horror, fixed on the living room entrance, where his wife's shadow began to take shape. The K9, hearing the voice, wagged its tail once, gently, but maintained its protective stance over the body. The smell of death, the exposed body, the dog, the silent accuser. And now his wife, about to enter the scene. The world wasn't just collapsing, it was imploding. The charade, the double life, the heinous crime, everything would be revealed in the next few seconds. The tension was palpable, cutting, like a sharp blade suspended over his head. He couldn't run, he couldn't hide, he couldn't lie. The K9 had ensured that, and his wife was one step away from seeing the darkest truth of his life. His wife's shadow lengthened at the living room entrance, a familiar figure who, at that instant, seemed the personification of condemnation itself. The politician, his name dissolving in a sea of guilt and panic, remained on his knees, motionless, like a statue of despair. His eyes, wide, fixed on the woman approaching with light steps, oblivious to the horror awaiting her. "Darling, are you here?" Her voice, once a balm, was now a death knell. "Where have you been? I said I'd come earlier to help with the wall." She stopped at the threshold, the afternoon sunlight framing her, a cruel contrast to the macabre gloom of the room. Her eyes scanned the environment, first with mild curiosity, then with growing confusion. The smell, the sweet and putrid veil of death, which for him was overwhelming, for her was just a strange, as yet unidentified note. The dog, the faithful K9, wagged its tail once, gently, in recognition of its owner, but its eyes, those dark and deep eyes, remained fixed on the body, and its protective, unwavering posture did not yield. It was the guardian of the truth, and it would not allow it to be reburied. The politician tried to speak, tried to scream, tried to beg, but his throat was dry, his voice caught in a knot of terror. He was a man of words, of fiery speeches, of empty promises. Now he had none. His wife took another step, curiosity transforming into subtle concern. What happened here? Why is the K9 like this? And this wall? What is it? Her gaze followed the K9, which, with an almost imperceptible movement of its head, directed her attention to the cement. Slowly, the woman's eyes descended, first to the red shoe, then to the hem of the dress, the fabric draped so unnaturally. A line of cement trickled down, like a grey tear, revealing more of the pale skin. A shiver ran down his wife's spine. It wasn't the cold of the house, but the cold of premonition. Her face, once relaxed, began to contort into a mask of confusion, then horror. She took a step back, stumbling over her own feet, her hands rising to cover her mouth in an instinctive gesture. The arm, the pale, inert arm, with the gold bracelet. The bracelet she herself had admired on his mistress's wrist at a social occasion. Before knowing the woman was her husband's mistress, the bracelet he had bought in Geneva, the bracelet he had said was a gift for an important contact. The truth, cold and brutal, began to unfold before her piece by piece like a macabre puzzle. The smell now was no longer mold, it was death, unmistakable, overwhelming. Her eyes, wide with terror, rose to the woman's face. Her dark hair tangled with cement, her face distorted in an expression of frozen agony. Her empty eyes, fixed on a distant point, were a mirror of the abyss opening beneath her feet. A sound escaped her throat, not a scream, but a choked whimper, a lament of disbelief and horror. She staggered backward, her legs failing, until her back hit the opposite wall, the same wall her husband was cementing. No. The word was a whisper, almost inaudible, laden with denial. It can't be. Her eyes, now full of tears and unspeakable pain, shifted from the body to her husband, still on his knees, a pathetic and defeated figure. Guilt was etched into every line of his face, in every tremor of his body. He didn't need to confess. The scene spoke for itself. The dog, the body, the fresh cement, the K9, as if understanding the magnitude of the revelation, let out a low lament, a sad howl that echoed in the room, a sound of mourning and condemnation. It wasn't just the discoverer, it was the witness. His wife, a woman of metal, accustomed to power games and appearances, felt her world crumble. It wasn't just the infidelity, the sordid secret. It was the crime, the murder, and her husband, the man she loved, or thought she loved, was the monster. The silence that followed was broken only by the slow drip of cement and the ragged breathing of the three beings in the room, the politician, his wife, and the dog. The air was heavy, dense with tragedy, with betrayal, with death. She looked at the body again, then at her husband. Her eyes, once full of love and trust, now burned with a mixture of horror, revulsion, and a cold, cutting anger. The image of his walled-up mistress was irrefutable proof of his crime, proof of his downfall. And the K9, his loyal companion, had been the instrument of his own condemnation. You... His wife's voice was a thread, laden with a pain that seemed to tear at her soul. You did this. The politician didn't answer. He couldn't. His life, his reputation, his family, everything was in ruins, and his wife, the woman he had sworn to protect, was now the first to witness the hell he had created. The world, which he had manipulated with such mastery, was collapsing on him. And it all began with a dog, a wall, and a secret that could not remain buried. The tension was palpable, cutting like a sharp blade suspended over his head. He couldn't run, he couldn't hide, he couldn't lie. The K9 had ensured that, and his wife was there before the darkest truth of his life. What would happen next? The silence now was more terrifying than any scream. His wife's question, "You did this?" hung in the air, a fragile thread stretched over the abyss of horror. The politician, his name now a distant echo of a fading past, did not answer. He couldn't. His mouth was dry, his tongue heavy, every muscle in his body paralyzed by the revelation. His eyes, once cunning and calculating, were now pools of despair, fixed on the face of the woman who, in seconds, had transformed from his silent accomplice into his judge. She didn't wait for an answer. His silence was more eloquent than any confession. The initial denial, the "it can't be," gave way to an icy certainty that seeped into her bones. The gold bracelet, the red shoe, the dark hair tangled in the cement. Every detail, once an anomaly, was now a piece of a macabre puzzle, assembled with brutal precision. A scream, not a scream of rage, but a scream of pure, tearing pain, erupted from her throat. She recoiled, stumbling again, but this time couldn't recover. She fell to the floor, her hands still covering her mouth, but now sounds escaped between her fingers, convulsive sobs that shook her body. The K9, sensitive to her anguish, let out another low lament, a sound of empathy and sadness that seemed to amplify the despair in the room. It approached her, nudging its muzzle into her hand, a silent comfort amidst the chaos, but she didn't notice him. Her eyes, swimming with tears, swept the scene again, the body, the cement, her husband. Everything merged into an image of unspeakable horror. The life they had built, the facade of perfection, the brilliant career, everything was a lie built upon an abyss of betrayal and blood. The politician, still on his knees, watched her collapse. Each of her sobs was a dagger in his own chest, not from genuine remorse for the crime, but from the imminent loss of everything he valued. His wife, his family, his freedom, the power, the influence, the life he had so carefully orchestrated, everything was disintegrating before his eyes. He was a man who had always controlled the narrative, who masterfully shaped public perception. Now, the narrative was out of his control, and the truth was an uncontrollable beast. She rose unsteadily, her eyes fixed on him, no longer with pain, but with a cold, incandescent rage that made him shrink. You killed her," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken, "and you were going to wall her up, like an animal, as if she were nothing." The revulsion in her voice was poison, corroding the last fiber of dignity he thought he possessed. The K9, as if sensing the change in atmosphere, stepped back, but remained between his wife and the body, an invisible yet powerful barrier. It was the guardian of the scene, the silent accuser that could not be bribed or intimidated. "I loved you," she continued, her voice rising from a whisper to a firmer tone, laden with contained fury. "I trusted you, and you are a monster." She looked at her own hands, as if they were soiled by his proximity. "My life, our life, everything is a charade." The politician's mind reeled, searching for an escape, an excuse, anything, but there was nothing. The fresh cement, the pale arm, the red shoe, the evidence was irrefutable. He had been caught red-handed, not by a camera, but by the most devastating witness of all, his own wife. "What are you going to do?" he managed to stammer, his voice harsh and unrecognizable. Panic, once a wave, was now a tsunami, sweeping away any trace of his former self. He was a naked man, exposed, defenseless. She stared at him, her eyes red and swollen, but with terrible clarity. "What am I going to do?" she repeated, the question echoing in the room. "What are we going to do? Do you think this will just disappear? That we can simply cover it up? Do you think I'm going to stay here and be an accomplice to your heinous crime?" The idea of complicity, even unintentional, seemed to ignite a new flame of horror in her. She looked at the K9, then at the door, at the outside world that until seconds ago was ignorant of such depravity. The isolation of the country house, once a refuge, was now a trap. "No," she said, her voice firm though still trembling. I won't live with this. I won't live with you." She took a step back, moving away from him, the K9 watching her every move, its dark eyes vigilant. The politician felt an even deeper chill. It wasn't just the prison, the downfall, the shame. It was the loss of his wife, the woman who, despite everything, was the anchor of his public life, the woman who had been the face of his perfect family. "Think of your career," he pleaded, a last desperate attempt at appeal and manipulation. "Think of the children. Think of the scandal. This will destroy everything." She laughed, a dry, humorless sound that cut through the air. "My career, our children. Do you think they'll care about your career when they know their father is a murderer? That he walled up a woman in his own house?" She shook her head, the image of the dead mistress etched in her mind. There's no career to save, no family to protect. You destroyed everything alone. The K9, as if sensing that the truth had been fully revealed, let out a bark. Not an alert bark, but a bark of finality, of conclusion. The country house door, which she had left ajar, allowed a gentle breeze to enter, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and the promise of a cold night. His wife took another step back, her eyes fixed on her husband, a mixture of revulsion and deep pain. "I'm calling the police," she declared, her voice now surprisingly calm, resolute. "I'm going to tell everything." The politician, in his desperation, tried to stand again, a slow and clumsy movement, his eyes wide with terror. "No, don't do it, please!" But she had already turned, her steps firm towards the door. The K9, with a last look at the body and the politician, followed her, its tail wagging gently, as if its mission was finally accomplished. The yellow light of the work lamp continued to illuminate the grotesque scene, the dripping cement, the pale arm, the red shoe. An infernal painting now witnessed by eyes that could no longer ignore. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of his wife's footsteps receding, and then the click of the door closing, sealing the politician's fate in a hell of his own making. The countdown to his downfall had begun. The click of the door was a gunshot, not a loud sound, but a dry, final snap that resonated in the silence of the room like a judge's verdict. The politician, still on his knees, reached out to the void, to the ghostly image of his disappearing wife. The air she had taken with her seemed to have been replaced by a dense fog of despair and condemnation. He was alone, completely alone. The yellow light of the work lamp, once a beacon in his macabre endeavor, was now a cruel spotlight, illuminating every detail of his personal hell. The fresh cement, still damp and malleable, was a stain of guilt, a shroud that refused to cover his truth, his mistress's pale arm, the red shoe, her tangled hair. Everything screamed his betrayal, his crime, his monstrosity. Panic, once a distant clamor, was now a deafening roar in his mind. His wife, she had abandoned him, not just the marriage, but the facade, the silent complicity he had expected her to maintain. She would not be his accomplice, she would be his accuser, the first. He tried to stand, but his legs trembled, refusing to obey. He fell again, his hands sinking into the damp cement beside the body, a sticky, cold sensation like death itself. He looked at his mistress's face, half covered, half revealed. Her eyes, once full of desire and shared secrets, were now empty pools, silent witnesses to his downfall. "No, it can't be." His voice was a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible, a pathetic denial in the face of overwhelming evidence. He tried to move the cement, push it back, cover the arm, the shoe, an instinctive, desperate attempt to erase the evidence, to undo what the K9 had revealed. But it was useless. Each movement only spread the material further, dirtying his hands, making the scene even more grotesque. The smell of lime and sand mixed with the metallic odor he now perceived, a smell that was not of wet earth, but of blood. His mind, once a labyrinth of political strategies and manipulations, was now a whirlwind of fragmented images. His mistress's smile, his wife's anger, the K9's muzzle digging, the gold bracelet gleaming. He had built his life on lies, on appearances, on control. But now, control had slipped away like sand through his fingers. Outside, the wind hurled softly, a cruel contrast to the storm brewing within him. He imagined his wife, phone in hand, her voice firm, denouncing him. Each passing second was another step towards the abyss. He could see the headlines, feel the weight of shame, the ruin of his career, the disgrace of his family, the children. What would they say? What would they think? The idea of fleeing arose, a flash of insane hope. Run. Disappear. But where? The country house, once his refuge, was now his prison. The door was closed, but the world outside was not. And the K9, the dog he had underestimated, the animal that had unearthed his secret, was with his wife. It was the living proof, the four-legged witness that could not be intimidated. He looked at the masonry tools scattered on the floor, the trowel, the float, the cement bucket. Construction tools transformed into instruments of a heinous crime. He had planned everything with precision, with the coldness of an engineer. But a single factor, a dog, had undone his masterpiece of concealment. A sound, a distant but unmistakable sound. Sirens. The politician's heart leapt into his throat. It couldn't be. So fast. His wife couldn't have called so quickly, and the police wouldn't arrive in a matter of minutes. It was his mind playing tricks on him, panic materializing his deepest fears. But the sound persisted, growing, approaching. It wasn't an illusion, it was reality knocking at his door. He dragged himself to the window, his body heavy, every muscle protesting. He pulled back the curtain, peering into the darkness that enveloped the property. And there it was, a blue and red light pulsing in the distance, cutting through the night's darkness like a beacon of relentless justice. It was them. The police, the country house, once a sanctuary of secrets, was now a stage for his own downfall. The K9 outside was perhaps barking, guiding them. The dog, the faithful companion, had become his executioner. The politician recoiled from the window, stumbling again, falling backward onto the fresh cement. His eyes fixed on the ceiling, then on his mistress's body. The irony was cruel. He had tried to wall her up so she could never speak again. But now she would speak. Through the cement, through the K9, through his own wife. The sound of the sirens was louder now, accompanied by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Time was up. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. The silence of the room was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps outside, muffled voices, and then the unmistakable bark of the K9. The living room door, which his wife had closed, now burst open with a crash. The strong beam of a flashlight swept the room, freezing the politician in the scene of his crime. Behind the light, dark silhouettes, and among them the K9, its eyes fixed on him, its muzzle sniffing the air, as if confirming the truth it had unearthed. The politician, in his last moment of lucidity, looked at the dog. The animal had no hatred, no judgment, only the truth, and that truth was his condemnation. "Hands up!" an authoritative voice echoed in the room. The game was over. The house of cards had collapsed, and everything, absolutely everything, began with a dog. "Hands up!" The voice, grave and authoritative, cut through the air like a cold blade. It was no longer a whisper of panic, but an unquestionable command. The politician, still prostrate in the damp cement, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, felt the weight of that order crush him. The game was over. The house of cards had collapsed. And everything, absolutely everything, began with a dog. The strong beam of the flashlight, a merciless ray, swept the room, freezing him in the scene of his crime. Dark silhouettes filled the doorway, imposing figures in uniforms, their faces obscured by the backlight. And, among them, the K9. The dog wasn't barking, wasn't growling. It just watched, its dark eyes fixed on the politician, its muzzle sniffing the air, as if confirming the truth it had unearthed. It was the living proof, the four-legged witness that could not be intimidated, now accompanied by a battalion of justice. The politician didn't move. His hands, stained with cement, and he now realized with something darker and stickier, remained submerged in the cold mass. Resistance was futile. Denial, a charade. He was there, exposed, naked in his depravity. His mistress's pale arm, the red shoe, her tangled hair, every grotesque detail was now a silent scream. an irrefutable accusation to the trained eyes observing him. One of the officers, a corpulent man with a stern gaze, advanced. His steps were firm, decisive, crushing the gravel the K9 had dragged inside. His flashlight focused on the body, then on the politician. A heavy sigh escaped the officer's lips. The scene was worse than any prior report could describe. The smell, the sight, the victim's silence contrasting with the criminal's mute despair. "Sir," the officer's voice was calm, but laden with unbreakable authority. "Stand up slowly, hands where I can see them." The politician tried. Every muscle seemed to have solidified with the cement. Shame, fear, exhaustion, everything bound him to the floor. He dragged himself, a slow and clumsy movement, his eyes still avoiding those of the police. The yellow light of the work lamp, once his accomplice, was now a relentless spotlight, revealing every flaw, every mistake. Eventually, he managed to kneel, then stand, his legs trembling, his raised hands dripped cement. A grey stain that seemed to symbolize the ruin of his life. The K9 beside the officer let out a low bark, almost a grunt, as if saying, "He is the culprit. I found him." "You are under arrest," the officer declared, the words echoing in the room, "for suspicion of murder and concealment of a body." The mention of the charges, so cold and formal, pierced the fog of his shock. Murder. Concealment of a body. The words were sentences, not just accusations. He could see the headlines, feel the weight of shame, the ruin of his career, the disgrace of his family, the children. What would they say? What would they think? The image of his wife, her voice firm on the phone, her betrayal, everything mingled in a whirlwind of despair. Two other officers approached, their handcuffs clinking. The metallic sound was the epitaph of his freedom. He didn't resist. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. His wrists were pulled back, the cold metal closing with a dry click. A final sound, as definitive as the click of the door his wife had closed. As he was led out of the room, his eyes swept the scene one last time. His mistress's body, now surrounded by yellow tape and the forensic attention that would soon arrive. The fresh cement, an improvised tombstone, the masonry tools, instruments of a crime, and the K9. The dog, the faithful companion, had become his executioner. Outside, the cold night breeze hit him, the smell of wet earth, now mixed with the scent of burnt rubber from the police car tires and the metallic aroma of the investigation. More blue and red lights pulsed, illuminating the previously isolated property, now an epicenter of scandal. Journalists, he knew, wouldn't be long in arriving. The country house, once his sanctuary of secrets, was now a stage for his downfall. He was gently pushed into the backseat of a police car. The dark glass separated him from the world, but not from reality. He looked back at the house door, at the hell he had created. The K9 beside one of the officers observed the scene, its work concluded. Its dark eyes, without hatred, without judgment, only the truth. And that truth was his condemnation. The police car engine started, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in his bones. The countdown to his downfall had ended. The downfall itself was just beginning. He was a politician, accustomed to controlling narratives, to manipulating perceptions, but now the narrative was his, and he was the villain. The story would be told not by him but by a dog that had sniffed out the truth where others saw only a wall, a dog that had unearthed not just a body, but the end of a career, the end of a family, the end of a man. The silence of the night was broken only by the distant sound of backup sirens approaching and the even more distant sound of his life crumbling. The police car engine rumbled low, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the politician's bones, an epitaph for the life he knew. Each bump on the dirt road was a physical reminder that his existence, once so solid and predictable, had shattered into fragments. Through the dark glass, he watched the lights of the country house diminish in the rear-view mirror, the sirens still pulsing, transforming his refuge into a beacon of disgrace. With every meter, the smell of fresh cement and damp earth was replaced by the night air, clean and indifferent to the catastrophe that had just swallowed a man. He was a politician, a man of power, of eloquent speeches and firm handshakes. Now he was just a handcuffed body, a pale face reflected in the glass, a potential number in criminal statistics. The image of the officers working, the yellow tape being stretched, the silhouette of the K9 beside one of them. Everything was etched into his mind with brutal clarity. The dog, the animal he had underestimated, the faithful companion who became his executioner, the silent witness to his downfall. The car accelerated, leaving the darkness of the property behind and entering the main road. The city lights, distant on the horizon, seemed to promise a different hell, an even larger stage for his humiliation. He imagined the camera flashes, the microphones being thrust into his face, the relentless questions that would tear his reputation to shreds. The narrative, which he had always controlled with an iron fist, would now be written by others, by newspapers, by social media, by malicious whispers, and above all, by the truth unearthed by a dog. His mind, once so sharp and strategic, was now a whirlwind of regret and despair. The children, what would they say at school? How would they cope with the scandal that would explode into their lives? The image of his daughter, with her bright eyes and unwavering trust in her father, hit him like a punch to the gut. He had promised to protect them, to build a secure future. Instead, he had erected a wall of lies that was now collapsing on all of them. And his wife, her betrayal, the call to the police, the coldness in her eyes when she left him in the room with the cement and the body. She had been his silent accomplice for years, accepting appearances, the power game. But when the truth came to light, she chose justice. Or perhaps, he thought with a bitter smile, she chose her own survival, her own narrative. She would position herself as the victim, the betrayed woman who had the courage to denounce her monster husband. The irony was cruel. He had walled up his mistress, but his wife had walled him up in the prison of his own actions. The car took a sharp turn, throwing him against the door. He could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs on his wrists, a constant weight, a reminder of his new reality. Freedom, once an inherent right, was now a distant memory. The cell walls, he knew, would be colder and more definitive than any cement he could mix. He closed his eyes, trying to escape reality, but the images persisted. The pale arm, the gold bracelet, the red shoe, and the canine's muzzle digging with relentless determination. The dog had no political agenda, no reputation to protect, no lies to uphold. It simply followed its instinct, sniffing out the truth hidden beneath the surface. And in doing so, it had unmasked not just a crime, but an entire life of deceit. The vehicle stopped abruptly. The doors opened. The cold night air enveloped him again, but this time mixed with the smell of asphalt and, he could swear, the smell of a gathering crowd. In the distance, he heard the hum of helicopters, the click of cameras, the murmur of voices. The news was already spreading. The country house was merely the prologue. The main spectacle was about to begin. He was pulled out, his feet touching the ground of a police station. The lights were dazzling, the faces curious and stern. There was no more darkness to hide in. No more silence to stifle the truth. The K9, he thought, had barked at the world, and the world had responded. His eyes, for a brief moment, sought the horizon, the point where the sun would soon rise, but for him there would be no dawn, only the twilight of a life crumbling brick by brick, cement by cement. The downfall itself was just beginning. The police car door opened with a metallic creak, a sound that echoed like the prelude to a nightmare. The wall of flashes exploded, blinding him for an instant. The roar of the crowd, once a distant murmur, became a deafening chorus of angry and curious voices. "Murderer! Corrupt! Where's the mistress?" Each question a stake to the chest, each flash an X-ray of his exposed soul. He was pulled out, his feet touching the cold asphalt of the police station. The night air, once a relief, now felt heavy, laden with the acrid smell of scandal. Police officers surrounded him, forming a thin shield against the fury of the press, but nothing could protect him from the truth that was now public. The truth, unearthed by a dog, was now a spectacle. His eyes, still blurred by the flashes, registered the microphones being thrust into his face, the relentless lenses capturing every tremor, every line of despair on his countenance. He was a politician, accustomed to the spotlight, but never like this. Never as the monster, the villain of his own story. The image of the K9, its muzzle dirty with cement, the determination in its eyes, floated in his mind. The dog had barked at the world, and the world had responded with a vengeance. Inside the police station, chaos gave way to a sterile coldness. Fluorescent lights hummed, the corridors were long and grey. The handcuffs were removed, only to be replaced by the sensation of imminent imprisonment. He was led to a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs. The silence there was more oppressive than the roar of the crowd. It was the silence of the sentence, of inevitability. An officer, different from the one who arrested him, entered the room. His eyes were tired, but professional. He placed a folder on the table. "Sir," his voice was monotonous, devoid of any emotion, "we need your statement." The politician tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Words seemed trapped, choked by the weight of guilt. He was a master of oratory, but now there were no speeches, only the naked truth. He looked at his hands, still stained with cement, a physical reminder of the crime he had tried to hide. I didn't," he stammered, the words dying on his lips. The officer didn't press him, he just watched, waiting. His patience was torture. The politician knew there was no escape. His mistress's pale arm, the red shoe, her tangled hair, everything was etched into his mind, a silent confession. He was led to the fingerprint room. Each touch to the ink pad, each press of his fingers onto the paper was an act of stripping away. His identity as a politician, as a family man, was being dismantled, replaced by a number, a criminal record. The mugshot camera flashed, capturing the image of a broken man, his eyes empty, his soul exposed. In his cell, the silence was absolute. The concrete walls were cold, impenetrable. He sat on the bunk, his hands covering his face, trying to stifle the images that haunted him. The country house, now a crime scene. His wife, the betrayer, the survivor. His children, whose lives would be irremediably scarred. And his mistress, the woman he had loved and destroyed, now an icy memory beneath the cement. The irony was a slow poison. He had built his career on the image of an upright man, a pillar of the community. Now that image lay in ruins, brought down by a dog, an animal that, without malice or judgment, had sniffed out the rot beneath the polished surface. The K9 sought no fame, no revenge, only the truth. And that truth had unearthed not just a body, but the end of an empire of lies. He closed his eyes, but there wasn't enough darkness to hide the reality. The smell of cement seemed to permeate his skin, his clothes, his soul. He was the architect of his own prison, the bricklayer of his own downfall. The distant sound of sirens, now more a lament than a threat, was the epitaph of his freedom. The downfall, he realized, wasn't just the loss of his career or his reputation, it was the loss of himself. He had become the monster he tried to hide, the villain of the story that would be told by a dog. And the world he knew was just beginning to listen. The cell door closed with a dull thud, a final sound that sealed his fate. The silence that followed was not peace, but a deafening vacuum, filled only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the echo of his own thoughts. The concrete walls, cold and impenetrable, were a cruel mirror to the wall he himself had erected, not just to hide a body, but to isolate his own truth. He was there, an unmasked politician, a man reduced to an inmate number. The handcuffs had been replaced by invisible yet equally strong barriers. Freedom, once an inherent right, was now a mirage, a distant memory that seemed to belong to another life, another man. His mind, once a strategic battlefield, was now a labyrinth of regret and despair. Every image, every sound of that fateful night, repeated in an incessant loop. His mistress's pale arm, the gold bracelet, the red shoe, and above all the K9's muzzle, dirty with cement, sniffing out the rot he had tried so hard to bury. The dog, an instrument of the law, a faithful servant of truth, had become the herald of his downfall. Outside, he knew the world was ablaze. The sirens, the helicopters, the camera flashes, everything would transform into screaming headlines, into relentless reports. The narrative, which he had always controlled with an iron fist, would now be written by others, by newspapers, by social media, by malicious whispers that would destroy his reputation, his family, everything he had built. He imagined his wife, the coldness in her eyes, the calculated decision to position herself as the victim. She, who had been his silent accomplice for years, would now be the heroine, the betrayed woman who had the courage to denounce her monster husband. The irony was a slow poison, corroding what little dignity he had left. He had walled her up in a marriage of appearances, and she had walled him up in the prison of his own actions. And the children, the image of his daughter, with her bright eyes and unwavering trust in her father, hit him like a punch to the gut. How would they cope with the scandal that would explode into their lives? What would they say at school? He had promised to protect them, to build a secure future. Instead, he had erected a wall of lies that was now collapsing on all of them, crushing their innocence beneath the debris of his own depravity. Guilt, a monster even greater than fear, devoured him from within. The smell of cement, he could swear, still permeated his clothes, his skin, his soul. It was the smell of death, of betrayal, of the end. He had mixed the mortar with his own hands, sealing not only his mistress's fate, but his own. Each brick, each layer of cement, was a step towards this cold cell, this inescapable darkness. He sat on the metal bunk, the thin, hard mattress, a physical reminder of his new reality. His hands, once accustomed to firm handshakes and eloquent gestures, now trembled, stained with the proof of his crime. He tried to close his eyes, but the images persisted, sharper and crueler than ever. His mistress's face, the surprise in her eyes in the final moment, the way her body contorted before the silence. The K9, the animal he had underestimated, the faithful companion who became his executioner. The dog had no political agenda, no reputation to protect, no lies to uphold. It simply followed its instinct, sniffing out the truth hidden beneath the polished surface of a life of deceit. And in doing so, it had unmasked not just a crime, but an entire existence built on falsehoods. The hum of the lights seemed to intensify, transforming into a chorus of accusing voices. He was the architect of his own prison, the bricklayer of his own downfall. There was no more darkness to hide in, no more silence to stifle the truth. The K9 had barked at the world, and the world had responded with a vengeance. For him, there would be no dawn, only the twilight of a life crumbling, brick by brick, cement by cement. And the world, he knew, was just beginning to hear the echo of his disgrace. The truth, unearthed by a dog, was now his only companion, and it was cold, heavy and inescapable. The silence of the cell was not empty. It was an echo of all the voices condemning him. The hum of the fluorescent lights, once merely an annoyance, now seemed to vibrate inside his skull, a dissonant melody for the symphony of his ruin. He was there, enclosed, while the world outside devoured his image, his story, his soul. Each minute was an eternity of regret and dread. The rough surface of the metal bunk scratched his skin, a constant reminder that silk sheets and feather mattresses were a distant memory. The smell of cheap disinfectant and stale sweat replaced the aroma of fresh coffee and jasmine that once filled his chambers. He, the man who shaped laws and speeches, was now shaped by the coldness of concrete and the rigidity of prison rules. The truth, unearthed by a dog, was his only companion. And it was cold, heavy and inescapable. It manifested in every beat of his heart, in every ragged breath. It was his mistress's face, pale and lifeless, emerging from the fresh cement. It was the canine's dirty muzzle, the unwavering gaze of the animal that could not be bribed nor deceived. The dog, a being of pure instinct, had torn through the veil of his charade with a ferocity no political adversary had ever dared. He closed his eyes, but the darkness offered no refuge. Instead, it became a screen for the horrors unfolding in his mind. He saw the camera flashes, the microphones being thrust into his wife's face. She, the perfect actress, the widow of his reputation, the courageous mother who finally found the strength to expose the truth. Her voice, once a complicit whisper, would now be a cry of condemnation, reverberating in courts and media. She didn't just wall him up in the prison of his actions, she would wall him up in history, cementing his image as the ultimate monster. The division of assets, the custody battle. Each step would be a public spectacle, a calculated punishment, a final blow to his already shredded dignity. The children, the thought of them was an even more potent poison. His daughter, with her eyes full of admiration, her unwavering trust in her father, the hero, how would he explain? How would they understand that the man who promised them a secure future had built a tomb beneath his own house? Their innocence would be crushed under the debris of his depravity, their lives forever marked by shame. He had promised to protect them, but he had exposed them to the worst kind of cruelty, the truth about their own father. Guilt, a monster even greater than fear, devoured him from within, corroding every fiber of his being. Outside, the world exploded. He could feel the frenzy, almost hear the chorus of accusing voices. The newscasts, with their impactful graphics and dramatic soundtracks, displaying the image of his country house, the violated wall, the fresh cement, the reporter's voice, grave and condemning, repeating the phrase that would become his epitaph. The politician who promised morality and transparency hid a macabre secret beneath the facade of his country house. Social media, a whirlwind of indignation and scorn, each post a nail in his public coffin. Memes, cruel jokes, his image distorted, dehumanized, from pillar of the community to national villain in a matter of hours. The canine, the executioner of his downfall. The animal had no political agenda, no reputation to protect, no lies to uphold. It simply followed its instinct, sniffing out the truth hidden beneath the polished surface of a life of deceit. And in doing so, it had unmasked not just a crime, but an entire existence built on falsehoods. The dog's bark, once a distant sound, was now thunder in his mind, a cry of truth's triumph over lies. He tried to find a comfortable position on the hard bunk, but comfort was a luxury he no longer deserved. Every muscle ached, not just from the physical exertion of his crime, but from the overwhelming weight of his new reality. He was trapped, not just by bars and concrete, but by the relentless cycle of his own thoughts. The images of the crime, the canine's frantic digging, the pale arm emerging from the cement, they repeated, a macabre film strip projected on the inside of his eyelids. He remembered the feel of the trowel in his hand, the smooth, cold cement, the meticulous care he had taken to ensure the wall was perfect, impenetrable. He had been so confident, so certain of his cunning. He believed himself untouchable, a master manipulator of circumstances and people. Now, that very wall, his masterpiece of deception, had become his tomb. The very tools of his crime were now symbols of his ruin. The silence of the cell was punctuated only by the distant sounds of the prison. A slamming door, a muffled cough, the shuffle of unseen feet. Each sound was a reminder of his loss of freedom, his loss of control. He, who once dictated schedules and commanded attention, was now at the mercy of a bell, a guard, a system designed to strip him of his individuality. He was just another number, another statistic in a world he once believed he owned. His mind drifted to the trial, the inevitable spectacle, the prosecutors hungry for a high-profile conviction, the media salivating over every macabre detail. His own defense, a futile exercise against irrefutable evidence. The K9 would be mentioned, its heroic act recounted, cementing its place in the narrative as the true hero. He, the politician, would be reduced to a footnote, a cautionary tale, a symbol of corruption and depravity. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a physical manifestation of his despair. There was no escape, no redemption, no turning back time. The cement was dry, the truth was exposed, and the K9 had barked. His life, once a carefully constructed edifice of power and prestige, had crumbled to dust, leaving behind only the stench of his secrets and the echo of his crimes. He was alone with the truth, and it was a more terrifying companion than any demon. It would haunt him, consume him, until nothing remained but the empty shell of the man he once pretended to be. He was an echo, a shadow of the power he once wielded. The empty shell now was his only truth. The mirror of his mind reflected not the cunning politician, but the murderer walled up in his own conscience. Each breath was a burden, each heartbeat a countdown to the final judgment. The air in the cell, heavy and stagnant, seemed to suffocate him, a constant reminder of the freedom he had stolen from his mistress, and now from himself. Outside, the sun would rise, but for him there would be no light, only the perpetual darkness of his actions. He imagined the newspapers, the bold headlines, the photograph of his country house, now a monument to his depravity. The wall, once a well-kept secret, was now a stage for tragedy. He saw the forensic experts, the camera flashes, every detail of his crime dissected, exposed, transformed into a spectacle. Dignity, once his armor, lay in tatters, trampled by the public's insatiable curiosity. The K9. The dog's name, he knew, would be etched in history, an unlikely hero, a beacon of integrity in a sea of corruption. The animal, with its instinctive loyalty and infallible scent, had done what no political adversary had ever managed, to bring down the empire of lies. The dog's bark, which once seemed a distant and annoying sound, was now the trumpet of final judgment, echoing in the corridors of his mind, announcing his ruin. He was the anti-hero, the villain, the man a dog had unmasked. Humiliation was a slow but potent poison, corroding what remained of his pride. He curled up on the bunk, desperately trying to find an escape, a moment of peace. But there was none. The cell was a claustrum for his thoughts, a stage for his demons. The image of his mistress, her pale and lifeless face emerging from the cement, was a tattoo on his retina. He remembered the despair in her eyes, her last breath, the silence that followed. A silence he had tried to cement over, but which now screamed in his mind. The children. The thought of them was an even greater torture. How would they see him now? Their father, the hero, transformed into a monster, their innocence stained forever. He had built a legacy of lies, and now they would pay the price. Shame would be their inheritance, the shadow of his crime, an indelible stain on their lives. He had promised to protect them, but he had condemned them to a life under public scrutiny, to whispers and pitying glances. His wife, she, the widow of his reputation, the perfect actress, would now be the saint, the victim, the woman who endured betrayal and cruelty. Her voice, once a complicit whisper, would now be a cry of condemnation, reverberating in courts and media. She would wall him up in history, cementing his image as the ultimate monster. The division of assets, the custody battle, each step would be a public spectacle, a calculated punishment, a final blow to his already shredded dignity. He felt the weight of each brick, each bag of cement, each lie that had built his life. The country house, his refuge, his sanctuary of secrets, had become his trap. The wall, his masterpiece of deception, had become his tomb. He had been so meticulous, so confident in his cunning. He believed himself untouchable, a master manipulator of circumstances and people. But truth, like an underground river, always finds a way out, and his had been unearthed by a muzzle. The hum of the fluorescent lights, once an annoyance, was now the soundtrack of his disgrace. He was the architect of his own prison, the bricklayer of his own downfall. There was no more darkness to hide in, no more silence to stifle the truth. The K9 had barked at the world, and the world had responded with a vengeance. For him, there would be no dawn, only the twilight of a life crumbling, brick by brick, cement by cement, and the world he knew was just beginning to hear the echo of his disgrace. The truth, unearthed by a dog, was now his only companion, and it was cold, heavy, and inescapable. The end, not of a story, but of a charade. He, the politician, the builder of empires of lies, was finally walled up, not in cement, but in the collective memory of a world that did not forgive. The K9 had dug deeper than any excavator, revealing not just a body, but the putrid soul of a man. And now, in that oppressive silence of the cell, he could hear, clearer than ever, the final bark, the bark of justice.